Can Indian companies make better use of metrics to establish and monitor a strong risk framework? That's our focal question for our conversation today. Hello and welcome to this special series leading up to the ICICI Lombard Risk Manager Awards. I'm going to throw a basic question at Rohit first and then at each of you, which is this. Here we are looking at risk measurement, moving from basics to best practices. But Rohit, give us a flavor. What do we mean when we say basic risk measurement? What do we mean when we say best practices in risk measurement?
Right. So I think, Manvi, we need to look at in the context of how corporate India has really embraced risk management as a subject. And I think with now a lot of corporates going overseas, really gaining the momentum, a lot of regulatory pressures coming in, I think it's the time when a lot of corporates are really waking up to saying, how do we actually use risk management as a tool? How do we make it part of business as usual? So what's happened so far is a lot of list management in organizations, where just to respond to regulatory needs which have come in as part of listing agreements and all, corporates have prepared the risk registers. They have done the basic assessments, but they've not moved really ahead in the journey of managing, mitigating and monitoring what progress they're making on those risks.
I'm going to jump across to your space in the pharmaceutical sector, Mr. Ramesh. Walk us through an example of, moves that you've made on risk measurement which have yielded, positive business impact and really drive home the point that this is what happens when you move to best practices.
Speaking about me, speaking about my own, I'm the finance CFO. There have been tremendous on the forex front, and he spoke about experiential learning. About 5 years ago, the rupee was actually appreciating tremendously from, say, about 47 levels. It was going to 44, 42, 39, and so on. And the entire finance world was talking about actually it going to further levels because there's so much of inflows into the country. At that point of time, we took a conscious call. There was, of course, discussion at the board level also. And we said, okay, let's cover about 90% of our total exposures and perhaps take, covers for a much longer period of time. So 3 years, 5 years, options for 5 years, and so on. But after touching a low of 38.80 or something, because of the turmoil in the rest of the world, really, the rupee started actually, depreciating. It went down to 41, 44, and so on. We were caught by surprise because this kind of volatility does not do us any good. In that particular year, we lost a lot of money. It's close to about 3% of our total turnovers. So that actually gave us a very different perspective. You need to calibrate the risk that you're taking, because whether you take that initiative or you don't take that initiative, you're actually taking a call. But if you do that, don't cover everything. So experiential learning is perhaps the best teacher. You learn that you don't cover a huge aspect of it, and don't take long-term bets. Take shorter-term bets and potentially take it in buckets again. And since then, we have actually recovered. We don't take the full, hedges for the full exposure that we have.
Right. It's always enlightening to walk through these real examples, and we'll get to strategic risks in a moment. But Mr. Mahapalesh, again, at the operational level, risk measurement. How have you approached it at the GMR group?
At the operational level, what we have identified, in the beginning of the year, we have worked out a figure called as earnings at risk. The earnings at risk would cover how our profitability will affect it during the year. Since we are into several business segments like airports, aviation, energy and highways, we do a sort of a stress test in the beginning of the year, and we look at the risk, what would affect our profitability, and we will see what kind of a value is at risk, and accordingly we will develop the risk mitigation plans.
Mr. Roy, I think you're in a unique position at the Clearing Corporation. I want to understand, what is it that you're measuring when I say, how are you measuring risk? What are the various aspects of it when it comes to Clearing Corporation?
CCL is actually risk manager to the financial market. Large financial firms, they do their trading in treasury activities, and then that comes to us for giving guaranteed settlement. We ensure that even if counterparty failure happens, nothing happens to the other party.
Exactly.
It essentially lends financial stability. But then we started looking at things very differently. We started looking at as to, if there's a very large failure, how do you then manage that large failure? You know, what would be the recovery mechanism which will ensure that that entity will go down under, but whole system would not get impacted, or whatever would be the impact, that would be known to everybody. You know, then we realize two things are very important. One is risk governance, that is, it should be very clearly understood as to what is required to be done, and second is whom should have what kind of information, transparency.
Okay, we're going to pause there for a moment. When we come back, actually a much tougher issue. How do you measure strategic risk? And I'm hoping we're going to get lots of interesting examples of just how to do that when we return. Welcome back. Our focus today is on risk measurement, moving from basics to best practices. But when you say risks, you have to clearly identify operational risks and strategic risks. Gentlemen, again, I'm drawing liberally on each of your experiences here. Mr. Gupta, you know, think about some of the strategic risks that a bank as large as State Bank of India would have encountered. Reflect on how you could have actually measured those risks. If not measured them, but at least had some sort of lights going off saying, pay attention to this area. Does anything particularly come to mind?
There was the teller system which came up in the 70s, and now there are the ATMs. Today, State Bank does 10 million transactions a day on the ATM network, 35,000 of them. If the bank had not responded to this in time, you won't have a competitive advantage today because you'll not be able to manage costs. Going forward, it's a question of your having a USP only because you can deliver at a fraction of the cost that you were doing it at. Or having put up this ATM network, the bank would have thought that this is a great revenue model. But then came the Reserve Bank regulation that any customer could swipe at any ATM, and up to 5 transactions a month, the customer could not be charged, but the bank would have had to pay.
Right.
And therefore, State Bank ended up becoming a issuer rather than a acquirer. So instead of a 400-500 crore net income on the ATM network, the bank is ending up paying today. Now, therefore, the bank has to respond to see whether this model of ATM should change to a third party or an OPEX model, so that the cost. So that is how risk keeps coming from outside, and you have to therefore think how you can change your model, how you can change your strategy to remain competitive and not lose market share.
What about early signals to each of these risks that were likely to emerge? You know, is there an early risk alert signal that makes you conscious of this? That's what it, you know, boils down to when we're talking about risk measurement. Or am I taking a utopian view of risk measurement?
No, it's very practical. For example, today financial inclusion is going to be the next push on banking, and financial inclusion therefore will happen to the 5 lakh villages which are 2,000 population or less. The current business model will certainly not be viable over there. You cannot have a brick and mortar branch with 5 people and be cost effective on a 400 family opportunity. So the strategic risk today is to evolve a model which will actually intermediate those people at a fraction of the cost, and there is a lot of work going on that. That is what is the response, how quickly you come up with a response, and more importantly than that, how efficiently you are able to execute on that is what will determine whether you succeed in the long term. The winners will be segregated from the not so good performers on the basis of execution.
Actually, let me respond to that, add to that rather. I think the short term you're concerned about mitigating the risk of volatility in earnings. But in the long term, I think risk management takes a strategic form and it actually becomes an existential question. If we don't take those judgment calls today and actually act for the future, it may pay off, it might not pay off, but the fact is you might not be in existence at all, or rather you'll be a laggard at some point of time. So it really becomes an existential question. And we actually are confronted with that kind of a situation quite often.
More often than not.
Absolutely, and I've spoken about the VUCA world. So let me talk about from my own experience. You talk about research and development projects. So we do various kinds of research, something which is where the outcomes could be fairly definitive, and there are certain things where you spend a lot of monies but the outcomes are not definitive at all. The kind of input and the output ratios can never really match, and this goes into something like a new chemical entity. We spend close to about 20% of our total research spends, which itself is a very large figure on something evolving something which is really a pie in the sky at this stage. But if you don't do that and spend it over a period of say 5 to 10 years, potentially you will not have existence after a period of time. So it really goes with the risk appetite of the organization. How much can you actually spare as risk capital, so to speak?
Mr. Mahavalesh, looking at the GMR group, there could be so many risks out there at the strategic level, many of them external.
That's right. Yeah.
Whereas what Mr. Ramesh just described is actually a very thought out sort of risk that a company is taken on. How much is it going to spend on R&D, for example? It's coming from within the organization.
Yeah.
But in your case, it could be external and it could be very debilitating. So, what's the approach to risk measurement that you've adopted?
The nature of our business has exposed into certain risk, like country risk itself. So, for example, our Mali International Airport issue, and also political risk also has affected us. And thirdly, the non-performance by our joint venture operators who are into our strategic partnership. So, the failure from the strategic partner side can be quantified to a certain extent. That is not a judgmental call. There we can quantify. But the failure from the political risk or from the country's risk, they are purely judgmental. The learnings what we have made to mitigate the country risk is that taking the litigation outside that country. For example, our Mali arbitration is happening at Singapore. Maybe we can go to certain other courts, and also the dues which we are supposed to receive from Mali can be treated as a sovereign debt. We are looking into those kind of aspects, and this is another way of looking into our risk management policy. The gentleman just now, he referred to Chinese partnership. Yes, there are certain failures on the Chinese partnerships also. So how do you mitigate that? One, on the currency aspect, second, on the non-performance itself, and third, non-availability of visas for the Chinese workers to work in India. So how to mitigate that? So we sent our people to China where they got trained and came back here. So these are certain costs which can be quantified, but unfortunately about 30 to 40% of these costs can be quantified, but other issues will be purely judgmental.
You come back to judgment calls, you come back to judgmental issues. I'll put it under an umbrella which I call the risk culture of an organization, and since each of you have raised it, a quick break, and when we return, Mr. Roy, Mr. Mathur, your reflections on risk culture and how you can build that, how you can ingrain it. That's in a moment from now. Risk culture, i.e., is risk management in the DNA of an organization, seems to be one of the most sort of pressing or pertinent issues that we've thrown up here in this conversation so far. So, Rohit, when I say risk culture, again, it seems amorphous.
Yeah.
And therefore, should you be measuring the risk culture of an organization? And if you decide to, how do you do it? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, Mom, it's a good point. And I think reflecting on what the fellow panelists have just said, is an important point. I think a lot of focus has been going on the measurement of risks rather than the management of risk and how organizations need to respond. Risk management is integrated and it's part of business management. It's not something different. And as long as it gets treated as something as a separate layer, we'll always have the issues of integrating it. what I've seen good companies do is they look at risk management and risk decisions as a point of uncertainty, and they want to have options around it and build scenarios around it. And I think that's part of business as usual. When you're taking critical decisions, when you have things linked back with your strategic plan, you need to not have just one plan, but you need to have multiple options. And I think that needs to start from the top. That needs to start from the board when they're looking at decisions, approving plans which are strategic in nature. They got to be challenging the management and asking what are the different options. Managements, when they're executing and they're looking at the strategic plans for the future, they need to be evaluating what are the plans, and that needs to flow through the organization. And I think that's the piece which is something slow to come about. That's not something which happens immediately, and I think that's the place where corporates would really need to focus on, to take the focus away from just identification of what risks are or even quantifying them, but really focusing on how we're planning and building different scenarios and how we're responding to it.
Okay. Mr. Roy, I mean, you have to do this on a continual basis, scenarios, and that's what you referred to. In the worst case scenario, what could be the damage done by the biggest player in that particular scenario? So, I come back to you to ask, how are you inculcating a risk culture?
Today, we have been taught with ABC style of management, where you look at the other part, which is more prevalent. But what you should start is, you should look at what's worst and what can happen, and how would you deal with such situation. You should also develop people who have a different kind of approach towards things, and it shouldn't be the guys who are deciding, who are business guys. They should be taking this call. The call should be taken, or the information should come to the board from a separate set of guys who are not part of this, so that you incentivize these activities differently. Otherwise, you will always have arguments coming that this will work, and in 90% of the time this is what you are going to get. But problem is only when that 10% hits, what would you do? Are you prepared for that? Now this is what actually, if you see Lehman case, it happened. The CRO of Lehman, he kept on saying for 2 years, the risk that you are taking, you cannot manage if suddenly market change. But no one looked at it, no one was willing to, and the incentive structure was such, everybody was making hefty money, in every way. So they were very happy with
aligned in a sense against his voice being heard loud and clear by the organization, and I think that ends up being the biggest risk. And are you listening to the guys who are analyzing your risk, and is there a structure in place where the company actually listens and responds? We're out of time, but gentlemen, I'd like one round of closing thoughts from you. I will not constrict them, but yes, we're grappling with this issue of risk management and trying to look at how Indian companies can really move to a better risk management framework. So final thoughts, or if you'd like, final bits of advice. Mr. Gupta, would you like to go first?
I think the biggest and most critical thing will be for business to appreciate risk and not push for business unmindful of the fact that there is a risk in it. And at the operational level, therefore, a lot of statistical modeling and use of tools. At the top end, it is equally important for the board and for risk managers to be accountable for opportunity loss of business. Otherwise, most often what happens is that you just go the conservative way to say, sorry, I think there is risk. And in the process, you not only demotivate business and lose an opportunity, you are not accountable for the loss that was caused because of a conservative approach. So really that balance has to come in, and that the board and the top management has to drive.
That's a very important flip side that you've raised as well, Mr.
Ramesh. I fully endorse his view on this. So essentially, risk management is everybody's responsibility. At the same time, there must be performance and compensatory systems in the company to actually make sure that there's a balance between the two. So it can't be that you actually take a lot of risks and actually the results are are disproportionate. At the same time, being absolutely conservative gets you all the rewards. So there has to be a balance between the two.
Mr. Mahavalesh?
Yeah, first of all, what we have done in our group is that formation of a risk management committee. So this committee consists of 3 independent directors, and they regularly monitor the risk management activity on a quarterly basis. That is the first thing what we have done. And secondly, we have developed a risk management framework that would consist of risk management policy, risk management processes and risk management infrastructure. So this will give us a lot of support to initiate risk management activities across the business segments. And we have a full-fledged risk management functioning, reporting to risk management committee itself.
Is it common to have risk management committees in companies that you have encountered? And, you know, just take that thought forward. A committee, but then there is also assigning that importance to what the committee has to say and do.
No, it's increasing now to have committees, and the reason for having committees is because many of these risks require a cross-functional team response really, and that's where if there is a response coming in silos from the functions, it really doesn't amount to a mitigation, and many times you need to pull in the right sets of people across different functions to come up with a response. And I would see a big utility for these committees really addressing that specific issue. And many times in organizations when risk management's been parked with an individual, there is also a concern over the amount of